Okay, let's get started. Yesterday, we were talking about um, what's called shlichus yad, um, which is taking an object that I'm obligated to watch over for someone else and taking it for myself. And there, the Torah says that this is a serious prohibition. And but once I am sholeach yad, I have the status of a gazlan, and therefore I'm liable for anything that happens, even though normally my level of guardianship would not require me to be responsible for any mishap. Um, so, but that's only if I take the item for myself with the intention to keep it. But what if I just want to use something for personal use? Uh, and I'm not really supposed to because I don't necessarily have express permission. So then you're called a shoel shalom midas. You're borrowing something without permission. That does not make you the same status of a gazlan because you're not intending to consume the item or to damage it in any way, to minimize it in any way. But so therefore, according to many poskim, you are in violation of halacha. But as long as you put it back where it's supposed to be, and it's still intact, so then your level of shomer does not change. So that's where we're up to. So we're up to the third line. He says, "V'im yodea b'virur she'ein hamafkid makbid alav mutar." And now, if you know for certain that the person who left you the object for safekeeping, you know for sure that he doesn't mind at all. Either he told you or you have the type of relationship where you're absolutely certain. So then you're allowed to use the item for personal use. And that's certainly true if it's the type of item where people generally would not mind if you use it for personal use. A person comes over and leaves me a stack of svarim that he needs me to watch while he's in the process of moving. And they're not like mint condition things, so he doesn't mind if I look at the svarim. So you don't have to worry about that. Because there's very little fear that there's going to be damage through my use to the object. But if it's the type of item where some people might prefer, that you don't use, that would not want you to use their item, afilu huchshash rachok, even if it's a small risk that through using it you could damage the item, and therefore it's possible that this person may not want you to use his stuff. Asur, then you're not allowed to. Vein ba'aveda, vein b'pikadon, whether it's when you've retrieved the lost item, or whether the fellow is giving you the item for safekeeping. And mishum shol shalomidas, because then you're taking something without permission. And so the best thing, obviously, is to always ask the person beforehand, do you mind, you left me this box of svarim that you wanted me to keep in my house while you're going through this move. Do you mind if I flip through this farm? Afilu in borilo shelo yikalkel klal, and that's true even if you're absolutely certain that you won't damage the stuff at all. Elin ken yadua lo shahamafki lo yakbid klal bazeh. Again, and I don't know why he's repeating himself, but unless you're absolutely certain that the owner doesn't mind. V'yesh osum v'pikadon mishum shlichus yad afilu b'tashmish she'ein derech b'nei adam lahakbid klal. Ki isur shlichut yad gezeras hakasavu b'pikadon shehufkad etzlo afilu b'davar hamutar. And there are those who say that when it comes to a pikadon, you're never allowed to use, something that's given to you for safekeeping. You're never allowed to use it for personal use, even if it's a type of use that the owner would normally not mind at all. And the reason why they are so machmir is because it's a pasuk in the Torah. And sometimes when the Torah says don't do this, you can't apply logic necessarily and say, well, it only applies here, it doesn't apply here. Imlo haya mufkar etzlo about that, afilu bedavar hamutarim lo haya mufkar etzlo. And this is true even if you went to your friend's house and he wouldn't mind for you to utilize it then, but once he leaves it with you for safekeeping, there are those who opine that unless he gives you express permission, you don't have a right to use it at all, even though you've used it 100 times when it was in your friend's house. And the reason is because it's a special Gzeras HaKasav. The Torah says, you as a shomer have heightened responsibilities. And therefore, unless he tells you expressly that he wants you to benefit from it, you have no right. Ubal nefesh yachush l'divreihem, and a God-fearing Jew should be concerned about this latter opinion, and therefore you should always wait to get express permission. And the Imrei Yaakov says in Kuf Chaf Beis, he says, Rod Saloma, after baha'alim lo nasnu lo leheji rishus lehishtamesh bo. He says the first opinion that is lenient will allow you to use an item that is in your protection, under your protection, if you know for sure that the owner would not mind at all. And that's when the owner did not give you express permission. And also the owner is unaware that you're using it. So the first opinion says, if it's something that people don't normally mind, so then you're allowed to make that assumption. He says, and therefore the argument is that even though they're not aware that you're using it, but once they discover that you've used it, they won't mind. That's the reason why the first opinion is permissive. He says, how is this different from what we wrote earlier in the chapter? That when you're walking through a friend's property, right, and he has an orchard, and he has, let's say, an apple tree, and you know that you've been to his backyard many times and he's offered you to pick apples from his apple tree, but here he doesn't know that you're walking through his property. And you there we said that even if you know that he doesn't mind, you're not allowed to take the apples. He says shiny. So why is it different over here, where this first opinion is permissive? Shiny hasam demairi bahanoas kiloi, mashein kin kan mairi bahanoas ishtamshus. He says there's a difference between consuming something entirely and just borrowing something where you're not using it up, but rather you're just borrowing an item, like flipping through a book, right? Versus eating the apples on your friend's tree. When you're eating the items on your friend's tree, you're consuming items, and you don't have express permission to do that. So therefore, we categorically said it's usher, even though you know that normally he doesn't mind for you to pick his apples. But if he's unaware that you're there presently, you're not allowed to take. But over here, the argument is of the more permissive opinion that since you're not consuming it, but you're just rather borrowing it, and it's going to remain intact after you've used it, so therefore we can be more lenient. Okay, so that's the argument. Okay. Questions, comments? If not, we'll go to the next sif, Chavtes.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
If you're using something that will not be consumed, at the time you become there's a different level of shmirah on it. If later on that you're not using it anymore, does your shmirah change back to a more easier type of shmirah, or you're less liable?
No. Right. So that's what he had set up above on the top part of this page. He said, as long as your intention is not malicious to steal it, but rather just to borrow it temporarily, even though it's not something that if it's something that sometimes people will not want you to use, but you use it carefully and you don't in any way damage it, you may be guilty of shoel shalomidas, of borrowing something without permission. You're guilty of that crime, But nonetheless, if you return it to its place of safekeeping and it's still intact, your level of shmira goes back to normal, right? And so if it gets stolen, let's say afterwards, and you're a shomer chinam, you're just watching it for free as a favor, you would not be liable for that as long as there was no negligence. Okay?
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's go on to the next halacha unless there's any more questions. Chavtes. The cholzman shaha'aveda etzlo. So what we keep flipping back between a pikadon and an aveda. A pikadon is something that someone gives you to watch for, with their knowledge that you're watching it. And an aveda is that you're watching something for someone who has lost it and you're waiting for them to retrieve it. So whenever a lost item is in your possession, chayiv l'shamra kiroi kederech hashomrim. You are obligated to watch over it in the same way that a shomer, that someone who has been entrusted with an object by the owner, has to provide it with a sufficient level of protection. V'lo dailo sheyanichena im chafatzim shelo. He says that it's not enough just to leave it with your stuff, with your possessions. If by leaving it with your possessions, you're leaving it susceptible to damage or to loss. Ki b'shelo rashai hu lanicham b'makom sheyirtzeh, ve'eno rashai b'shel acherim elo b'makom hamishtameh. He says, when it comes to your own possessions, you can be as cavalier and as reckless as you want when it comes to your own possessions. So I know, like there are some young men who I will not implicate by name, who I know very well. When it comes to their own possessions, they're not as careful to put them away neatly and to leave them off the floor, and so forth. And so if they get damaged or they get dirty or they leave it out for someone to step on and break, new. So then their stuff breaks. But you can't be that cavalier with someone else's possession. You can't argue, well, I'm not treating it any worse than I would treat my own things. That's not a defense. You have to actually be more careful with something that is entrusted to you for safekeeping than you are with your own possessions. V'chein b'pikadon, and the same thing is true when something is given to you for safekeeping. So both for an aveda and a pikadon, this halacha applies. The ketza derech hashomrin. So what is that level that we're describing? That we're saying that you have to treat it as any object that you're watching over that does not belong to you. You have to do kederech hashomrim, the way that a guardian normally watches things. He says hakol lefi hapikadon. Everything is according to the item. It depends on the item itself. Yesh derech shmirato lahaniach bechatzer hamishtamer. There are some items that it's sufficient if you just leave them in a courtyard or like a backyard that has some level of protection. So kigon, chavilos pishtan hagidolos v'chayotze bohem, such as bundles of flax that you find, agricultural items. You're not going to bring those into your house, so you can sufficient for you just to leave it in your backyard, as long as it's something it's a protected backyard that's not exposed to other people being able to see it. I guess, if you find the bicycle, you're not obligated to bring the bicycle in your house, but you would be obligated to put the bicycle, let's say, in a locked garage or chained to something so that it can't just be stolen. I'm thinking to myself, I'll be honest with you, and please don't share this with other people. I don't keep my garage locked. So anyone theoretically could walk into my garage. There are two doors to my garage from the outside, and anyone can walk in at any time. My kids have their bicycles there. I have some tools in the garage. I have a refrigerator in the garage, which has food in it. But our thinking is that, we're not, Do any of you have the same attitude towards stuff that you keep in your garage, or does everyone have the garage locked? Maybe it's just us who are crazy. So the point.
Now we're all afraid to reveal that so that they can't go from garage to garage.
Well, I think you're safe on this among us girls. But the point I'm making is that when I'm looking at this halacha, I'm thinking to myself, just because my bicycle may be unprotected and unsecured doesn't mean that I have a right, if I find the bicycle, doesn't mean that I have a right to store it in the garage with my bicycles, because maybe my level of shmira on my bicycles is perhaps somewhat reckless, somewhat irresponsible, and I have to be more careful with watching someone's item than I have to be with my own. And I guess it would depend on what is negotiated with the owner. So let's say a guy brings over his bicycle to my house and he says, listen, I'm going on a trip. Can I store I'm moving. Can I store my bicycle in your garage? And as long as I disclose to him that, listen, I don't keep my garage locked. If you're willing to store it here and take that risk, then I'm happy to store it with you. Look, as long as it's negotiated in advance. But if I find the lost bicycle, then I guess I would have to keep it more secure than I would keep my own bicycles. So it all depends on what is considered to be a societal standard. So when it comes to an agricultural product like a bundle of flax that's used to make linen, then there's nothing wrong with keeping it in your backyard. But but there are other kinds of things that are normally kept inside the house. Clothing, right? You're not going to keep clothing out in your backyard. You're going to bring it inside your house. And there are other kinds of things that it's not just enough to bring it into your house, but you put it in a chest, and you maybe even would lock the chest with a key. Big day meshi, like, for example, very valuable silk items or gold and silver utensils. Sometimes some people keep that under a lock and key. It all depends on what the convention is, right? Excuse me. He says, and the same thing is true, let's say, with cash. Sometimes people keep cash, large amounts of cash, will keep it locked up in a safe. Or sometimes people will keep money. The Gemara describes that the best place for storing money is to keep it buried in the ground, which was a standard, I guess, in the old days. And the reason is that many times people do not store money in the ground because it's not so prevalent to have thieves, ransack your house. And therefore, as long as it's stored safely away in a secure place, so then you're allowed to store it that way. In other words, basically, it all depends on what society would deem this type of storage as safe storage. So, and then he says, but when, let's say, you're traveling with the item that has been entrusted to you, or let's say you're traveling in order to return it to its owner. So whenever you travel, you need to actually place additional safeguards on protecting the item. So that you have to make sure that the item doesn't leave your sight or doesn't leave your, wherever you're holding it until you get to your house and you can lock it up properly. So it all depends on the standards. So, I mean, for most people, keeping it in a locked trunk might be acceptable. But let's say it's a very, very valuable piece of art. One might argue that keeping it in a locked trunk is not sufficient if it's worth, let's say, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I guess it all depends on the value of the item, its delicacy, its constitution, and so forth. And so therefore he writes, along these lines, the teva sheyesh ba ochlin lo yaniach ba begadim ki stam teva hi chatura etzel achbarim kisheyesh ba ochlin. He says you should not leave clothing in the same box as food, because we assume that whatever critters are going to be nibbling on your food are also going to be nibbling on the clothing. And therefore, you have to be very careful. We discovered when we moved here that moths are much more prevalent in Canada than they are in California, for whatever reason. It's got to do with the climate and things like that. But we discovered a lot of our clothing, our wool clothing gets eaten up and when we leave it in the closet, unless you put mothballs in the closet. And I guess you'd have to do the same thing when, let's say, if you're protecting someone's property, you'd have to store it in such a way that it's not susceptible to getting nibbled at by the critters. Here he's talking about mice, but it's the same thing. The kol shekain cheder sheyesh ba ochlin, and the same thing would be true. You shouldn't store items like clothing in the same place, in the same room where you store food, if the food is if that room normally gets a lot of mice. Ela yitla habegadim al hanes v'lo yaniach acher mikanes b'cheder shapikadam munachsham. But rather you should hang the clothing on, the word nace is probably some kind of hanger, or a hook or a pole, so that it's not susceptible to attack by small creatures. And you should not allow people to go into the room where the pikadon is being stored, even though you normally would never suspect anyone of taking things for themselves. Like if you don't know a person, you shouldn't allow the item that you're watching to be accessible to them. So, for example, if a repairman comes to my house and I'm charged with watching over a valuable item, I shouldn't just allow him free reign of the house and give him the opportunity to access that item. It's one thing if I do that with my own possessions, but I shouldn't do that with other people's possessions that I've been charged with guarding over and protecting. Okay. So the Imrei Yaakov says in Kuf Chaf Gimel over here, he says, I have an obligation to watch over the items in the way that a shomer is tasked to watch over the items. Now, what about the following scenario? Let's say I leave an item in a place where it's not normally an appropriate place for me to leave it. So in other words, normally this thing should get locked up in a closet, but I left it out in the open. V'nignaf misham o avad, and then it gets stolen from that place. Afilu ne'enas sham, kegon shenafla dleika b'sarv kol habayis. Even if it was a complete mishap, that even if I had kept it locked up in a closet, it would have been destroyed. So for example, a fire, God forbid, breaks out and it burns down the house where I was storing this item. But I was negligent and I left it in an unsecured place. So this is an interesting shaila. It's called by the Gemara Tchilaso b'pshia, v'sofo ba'ones, where I do a negligent act, but the cause of this object's destruction is not my negligence, but rather an accident. Okay, so the question in halacha is, am I chayiv or am I patur? So again, the scenario is, I was negligent. I left it out in a place where normally that would be insufficient guardianship, but the fire was the cause of its destruction. and a fire is an onus that was beyond my control, such that even if I had kept it in a secure place, it still would have been destroyed and I would be potter. So am I chayiv in this case or not? So hareza posheya v'chayiv l'shalim. So the initial psak halacha is that because you started off doing an act of pshia, you have to pay, even though the cause of the damage was not your negligence, but since you started off negligently, then you have to assume all responsibility for the item. But to qualify that, he says, because of hasma, de'eno chayiv al tchilaso b'pshia v'sofa ba'ones, ele imkein nuchal limtzo makom litlos bo v'lomar tam di'ilu lo pasha v'tchila lo haya ira bo ha'ones. That's only true if it can be successfully argued that had I not been negligent in the first place, this mishap would never have happened. Had I not been negligent by leaving it in an unprotected area, the fire would not have broken out. V'hachanami tzrichin lomar in lo pasha v'hayamaniach hapikadum be'argaz hayanosen libo lahatzil ha'argaz tzvei ad kam l'shon. In other words, you have to be able to argue that had I put it in a chest and the fire broke out, I might have been able to run into the burning house and just pull out the chest. But because I left it just strewn together with other stuff, and it's not in a protected box, I'm unable to save it because of the fire. That's where we say that that you're going to be liable. But if a fire broke out such that even if it had been in the protected locked box, it still would have been destroyed, so then according to the Shema, you're not going to be chayav in that case. You can only be held chayav if, as a result of your negligence, the mishap caused its destruction, or you can in some way correlate your initial negligence to its irretrievability afterwards. Okay. Did that make sense? Did everyone follow along with that logic? Okay, I hope so.
I don't know. We might want to tomorrow morning do an example of that, because I think I'm getting it, but I'm not entirely sure.
So
if we have time now, that'd be great.
Very simple example. The example that he's giving. I've been entrusted with watching over a very expensive silk garment. Okay, and instead of putting it in the chest to make sure that it's well protected, I leave it out. I put it in my closet with all of my clothes. Okay, and a fire breaks out in my house, and the house burns down. And because everything was just all together in the closet, it went up in flames with all of my other clothes. But if I had kept it in a box, I might have been able to retrieve it from the burning house because it had a discrete location, separate from all of my other large items. And therefore, I can be held liable for that. But by contrast, if the conflagration was so great that no matter where in the house it was stored, it still would have been fully incinerated, then I'm not going to be held responsible, such that if I had it in a locked box, it still would have burned and would not have been retrievable. So then I'm going to be I'll be off the hook, because I'm off the hook for fires that happen in the house. So
that makes sense, Rabbi, to me. But the part that I'm missing is it seems like your negligence was still responsible for the loss. I thought we started by saying if somehow the loss happened not due directly to your negligence, but you were negligent, you could still be held liable.
Liable, yeah. So that's the latter case. In other words, it's because normally a person is patur from all onsin, and a person is exempt for any onus that happens. But if you can,
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the asterisk to that is that's only true when the onus could not be averted, regardless of how careful I was.
So the onus is the fire, and
the onus is the fire,
Okay, I
And
got it.
and the fire I was not able to avert. That's an onus. But if I had been more careful with where I stored the object, perhaps I might have been able to retrieve it from the fire without without it being damaged.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Okay,
We'll see you.